Hello out there! Welcome, welcome, welcome! Come on in, come on in. We have a nice, healthy crowd today because you're interested in learning about first chapters. And why wouldn't you? After all, first chapters are that first impression that you have. So, yes, come on in, and we are going to talk about first chapters today. I'm super excited about it. I have at my side Gareth in his story doctor outfit.
Hello. Step on
Yeah,
into the clinic.
step on in, step on in the spider's head, right, or whatever it is. But yes, we are here to discuss how to begin your book because beginnings are important. It is that first impression you give to the audience, or potentially somebody who's going to purchase the book, like an editor or an agent or something like that. So that's really important as well. So and we're going to discuss how to factor that when you're writing. Uh, lots of things with beginnings. I'm excited to get started. What we would love to see from you, though, are any thoughts you have because we want to cover any questions you might have. So, and we are live, so feel free to flood our chat with all kinds of questions you have about the beginning of your book and that opening chapter and certain questions, concerns that you have, or even if you have good advice, you can add that as well. And look, we have Katherine joining us as well from her lovely extension that she just finished in her house.
I know, right? Isn't it beautiful? Sorry, guys, technological difficulties today.
No worries, no worries. Now, Catherine is on our team, and she often is one of the readers for our first chapter reads, which is something that we offer here at AutoCrit. So she can speak to a lot of personal experience about certain things that might come up a lot in new writers. So it's nice to see, though, she has the data. She knows what happens behind closed doors, what works between those covers, cover of your book, and she will speak to the truth.
Oh, yes, the truth and nothing but the truth.
All right. So that being said, let's go ahead and get started with some points. I know Gareth had some points. One is certain things that you want to do. So this is positive things you want to do with your opening. And we have here assertion of the genre. What do you mean by that, Gareth? How are you assertive in your genre?
Yes, there's a lot of things I think today that we'll go through in terms of first chapters because, the first chapter really is so crucial. Um, just to drive the point home, one of the things that I will do, especially, and you got to think of readers, they're not going to sit and read an entire book for the sake of it. Oh, I'll give it a chance is not really a thing anymore. Certainly not in the modern day.
Nope.
And while usually I'm the type of person who more or less never walks out of a movie, I used to pride myself on that. And when it came to books as well, was always I will stick with it. Uh, but that personal pride has fallen away
Yep.
in recent years. I have started giving up on things because I'm thinking there's only so much time in life. Thank you very much. And with novels, it's the first few pages. You would maybe get the graces of maybe 5 chapters, something like that, from a reader. That's on the reader side of things. But when you're dealing with prospective publishers and agents, the people who are actually looking at books, they may request. Usually, what's said is the first 10 pages. People will read those. The first chapter, first couple of chapters. Now, you may be asked to send 100 pages. A lot of the times they'll say send the first 100 pages. They're actually reading the first 10, getting an idea of what the story is and what your writing style is before a decision is being made. It's that fast, it's that quick. And this is why a lot of things have to happen fast in the beginning to make sure that anybody who's looking at it feels comfortable, knows they're in the right place, and actually gets hooked by the story on top of that. So it's actually layer upon layer of things that are going on here. So today we will actually have a selection of things to do. This is ingredients of a great first chapter or an enthralling first chapter. So we're talking about when we say first chapter, it's kind of opening. Not every technically first chapter 100% is going to contain all of these, but at least the first two or three as your story opens up and welcomes people in, because you can have very, very quick first chapters that are just a really short thing stylistically that you're playing with as an author. So don't feel like this is some kind of. That's why I say it's ingredients. It's not
Yeah.
any kind of strict rules that you have to abide by, because it's not. It's not. There are no strict rules, more or less, in some degrees. However, when we go over the things that should be in there, we'll also go over some of the things that you want to avoid, just to give you kind of a double perspective there on that. And one of the first things that really should be in there as one of these ingredients that you're mixing into your first chapters is an assertion of genre. And when we say assertion of genre, it's having an element of the things that are happening within that first chapter that are telling people this is the type of book you thought you were picking up. So if it's a horror novel, I expect some kind of element of horror. I expect something off. I expect perhaps an outright terrifying thing to happen in those first moments that really says, yes, welcome to the land of horror. You're in a horror novel. The same kind of thing with, even if it's not horror, but Gothic is quite nicely tied to horror, but it stretches across all genres as a kind of framework. But if I'm stepping into a Gothic novel, I expect in the opening that it's going to have Gothic flavor to it. There's going to be descriptions. There's going to be the creaky old house and talking of family lineage and things like that. It's like, yes, Gothic. I'm where I'm supposed to be. Of course, action adventure. We want to open with a bit of action and adventure. A kind of feel. We want. I guess that's with the assertion of genre. We want to feel that tone very, very quickly. And quite frankly, without paying too much attention to it actively by yourself, when you combine a lot of the additional things that we'll talk about today, the assertion of genre quite often emerges from getting those other things right. Because when you're dealing with the other tips that we have, it bleeds on through, but it's in the list by itself because it's something that you do want to look out for when you're reading back over your opening and your first chapters and thinking, when somebody gets kind of 10 pages into this, is it obvious that it is a sci-fi, that it is a horror, that it is what they thought it was going to be?
Yes, definitely. Catherine, any thoughts about establishing genre early on and how that helps manage audience expectations?
Yeah, I think that, well, Gareth summed it up beautifully. That we should have an idea of the genre you're reading, and especially if you're writing genre fiction, remembering that it needs to be in the first chapter and not relying on an opening or a prologue or an introduction. Especially now that Kindle's default is to open an ebook to chapter one, which means anything before it, the reader may not even know it exists unless they think to go backwards. So you really do have to use chapter one as the opening of your book.
Yep.
And make sure that if you did set the tone in the prologue, that you set it again in your first chapter. I think that's one of the biggest things. Nonfiction is a little different, but especially for fantasy and horror and mystery, that there will be an opening and they'll be like, okay, the authors will say, I've got this already laid out. This was set up in the prologue. But if the reader never reads the prologue, will they still understand what genre it is when they read your opening chapter?
Exactly. Somebody posted, how soon should genre be revealed in short stories? Short stories generally don't have multiple chapters, but obviously you have even less time in a short story, so get it out as fast as possible. First sentence. I'm just kidding, but yes, quick. All right, moving on to another one of Garrett's ingredients. We have a glimpse at the theme. And what do you mean by that, Gareth? What is this glimpse we're talking about?
Yeah, this one's interesting because it's one of these really great things that is always great to talk about and try to explain because it's so conceptual. People are like, theme, what does that mean and how do I see it?
Right?
Now, that can be tough because it varies all the time, as themes do. It's what's the story actually about? What's going on under the surface here? And when I say a glimpse, it doesn't mean to spill the beans on that and make it overt, but you should start to see a little bit of it. And you'll be familiar with this term because it actually shows up on our AutoCrit beat sheet as well, that you can use to plan out your story coming right after the introduction. So we start the story, we get a glimpse at theme. It's just to make sure that we're kind of starting to hint at what this story might actually be about. So, for example, if the theme of your story is family ties, what's being talked about underneath it all is the nature of family and what family means. That in the beginning here, very very quickly, we start to see what's going on with the main character in terms of family. How is that presented in the story? and that's it.
Yeah,
I'm sure Catherine or Daniel, you may have other ideas based on different themes that could maybe arise.
yeah, absolutely. Catherine?
Well, I like that Gareth said it's really dependent on genre too. Like, for example, a mystery, you should know early on what kind of mystery you're reading, or have a foreshadowing at the conflict to come in the very beginning. That's something I know Daniel and I have both said a lot in first
Hmm.
chapter critiques that we've done. But something like fantasy, we don't necessarily need to know that it's good versus evil if it's an epic fantasy and just say it's going to be this person versus this person, but to at least have a hint that here's the main character, here's where they're starting, and we know sort of at a glance what they're aiming toward, what's their main goal, and have that hinted instead. And that goal can sort of take the place of sort of a good versus evil theme in that case. Or a romance, you know, okay, well, the theme of the romance is the guy's going to meet the girl, they're going to get together, and by the end, it's supposed to have a happily ever ending. Or girl meets girl, or guy meets guy, but whatever it is, happily ever after ending, and it's about them overcoming obstacles in their relationship. But the individual person's goals, again, are what we need to see here. Is one of their goals to live in abroad, and one of their goals is to move into a small town, and that's your conflict for your story, basically.
Yeah, the theme is something that can be more than plot, right? Because like Gareth was talking about, family ties. It probably connects to the plot, right? The plot may involve a character needing to go on some adventure on behalf of their family or something, or the family is getting ripped apart as a result of the adventure, and they have to get back together. But the important thing with the theme is, to Gareth's point, is it tells you a little bit about the why. It's not so much the what, it's the why does this story matter? What am I going to walk away from it with? Kind of. And to his point, it doesn't have to be on the nose. It doesn't have to spell out the moral of the story is going to be, always stop and smell the roses. However, if you have a character come out and they're like, wow, you're always on the go, do you ever slow down? You get the idea. Oh, okay, this is a story about somebody who's going to have to figure out how to stop and smell the roses a little bit. And to some degree, I would say I would, for early writers, actually venture a little bit further on the hitting it on the nose versus being too coy about it, because you can always pull back because the audience could be like, okay, that was really obvious and kind of lame. But what I often see is I just don't even know why I should care. Um, and that's a
Yeah.
bigger problem because I need to get invested, right? So if I have an idea of, oh, this is going to be a story about, whatever, the generation gap, or it's going to be, and it's kind of obvious, that actually can be to your benefit. At least that's how I feel about it. Any other thoughts, Gareth, before we move on?
Yeah, I like what you said there, Daniel. Especially the kind of stop and smell the roses thing. I think that's a great example of what's kind of the theme, what's going on in the story, and yeah, everything else. I mean, I would always tend to err on the side of maybe being a little too overt than not overt enough, because you don't want your opening to be meandering, not offering anything for readers to hook into and think that this is going somewhere. If it opens and it's just all very slapdash and vague, and 4 chapters in, I don't actually have any sense of meaning or direction or anything to this story, I'm not reading anymore. You're wasting my time by that point. So I would err on the side of being maybe a little more overt, but the more you get used to it and the more experience you get, you can start to dampen that down, water it down more. So it's just kind of peeking through, and again we get that just a glimpse of it.
All right, now moving on, we have start in medias res. No clearing your throat. What does this mean? Technical terms.
Yeah, stop clearing your throat. It's the build
Sorry.
up in the boring, the boring build up in the beginning. We don't really want the whole concept. I'm sure pretty much 90% of everybody here is going to know this already. It's one of the top pieces of advice in writing, and it still stands 100% true. Start in medias res. You're starting as close as possible to what we call the inciting incident. So
Yeah.
it doesn't just mean starting as close to the inciting incident as possible, but start in the middle of things happening. We don't
Mhm.
want to be, and this is the kind of concept of clearing your throat, or you could consider it spinning your wheels or revving the engine before we get going. You don't want to be doing that, just spending a lot of dead time getting things ready for something interesting to actually start happening.
Right.
Start with the something interesting. And a lot of the time, especially with novice writers, the easiest way to actually figure this out is to go back and look at some of your early stuff, or some of the stuff that you're writing potentially even right now, and you will almost entirely, without a doubt, looking at it through this lens, think, yes, the story could actually just start here.
Yep.
The stuff that came before that is not actually necessary. And if it is necessary to the plot or the characters, it can be sprinkled throughout later on. It's not
Yep.
necessary to preset it and again spin those wheels or clear your throat before you actually start to talk about the interesting stuff.
Right.
Get right into it, starting in medias res. Now, this will touch a little bit on something that we'll talk about coming up. But one of the things to remember too is when it says start in medias res, it doesn't mean starting a little before the inciting incident, as if in your story your character turns a corner. Let's say they turn a corner and look down an alleyway and they witness an event, and that's the inciting incident. It doesn't necessarily mean that your story has to start at the moment they're approaching that corner. That's not the point. It means that the beginning is active, that there are things happening, and the easiest way to deal with that is when you begin your tale and you're introducing us to the main character, have them be dealing with a problem at that time. So there is actually something going on, and it doesn't have to be entirely related to the main plot. They're going to stumble into or walk into the inciting incident that kicks everything off pretty soon, but have them be dealing with a problem the moment we join them.
Yes, James talked about this. I overcompensated and started too late. Yes, you can, in fact, start too late. I would say too late is where you're so engrossed in action that you can't find your footing because you actually need some orientation. And sometimes writers will deliberately do this to disorient the audience. I think of Christopher Nolan kind of does this in his movies. But it's a tricky strategy, right? Because it means the audience is trying to play detective as to what is going on. So yeah, you don't necessarily want to go as far as that, and that's what Gareth was getting at. You do want to find the balance. They say in late, out early, but not too late. You need to get in with enough time that we can get some footing before things start to go too crazy. Just so we have an orientation.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Catherine.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was actually looking over the Kindle stats, which are open to anybody that wants to Google them. They release all their reading stats for 2021 already. And that came out in like November. So I guess December doesn't count. But that it's amazing that only 60% of people only read the first sentence.
Wow.
And it's like, so you have literally one sentence, one, possibly two, which was like 15%, but like one sentence to hook people. And so to Garrett's point, you don't throw people in mid inciting incident because you've missed your entire beat of the life before. But there should definitely be a hook and a promise of the story to come that's action based, or not like a sword fight action based, but something active for the character beyond just she woke up this morning and it was sunny outside, and then we know, okay, we're going to have to live through this character's entire day before we get to what the deal is here. I'm just going to move on to another book. Start off closer to, I read one recently, and I think we might have mentioned on other lives, like, this was the first day that I died, the first time that I died, and I was like, okay, that's hooking. The first time I died, well, what's the second time, and why are you still alive to write the book if it was the first time you died? And then they gave their life before. So the first time I died was like any other day or something, and I know I'm misquoting, so I'm sorry if the author's watching. Or if Gareth knows, I feel sort of bad, but and then from there, they're like, I went to the office, and then I had lunch, and I did this, and I did that, and then I ran into the vampire. And that's my Katherine short few second summary of the first chapter. But you know what's coming, so you want to read about this person's life through the chapter because you want to know what was their life like before they died the first time. And you know they're going to die the first time, but it's still a hook because you want to know why and what happens.
Yeah, and I think part of it as well, again, part of the reasons why all of this is not 100% prescriptive in a complete structural sense is that sometimes, in some stories, dropping them right into the middle of hell itself, as everything kicks off right at the beginning, can work. It does depend on your story, but in the sense of that being your story, you're still starting in medias res in that case. But if it doesn't fit for your story, don't be tempted because somebody said start in medias res to push it too far forward, because that can also be a problem. It's just make sure that things are active when we actually get in there. Something is underway.
Yeah, this kind of gets to it. It's I've been told by readers they want to learn about the main character and show their normal life before the inciting incident. Is it crucial to paint that? Yes, sometimes. See, this is the thing, right? The one thing I will say is if you show normal life, well, guess what? That's normal. Is it normal to us as well? If it's normal to us as well as them, it might be rather boring. If a normal life is, well, they live at the bottom of the ocean, then that's kind of interesting. So even though their world hasn't gotten jostled by the story, we're interested in their normal life. So you kind of have to think about what normal life even looks like to them. Because if it's normal to us and them, that could be a kind of a bland way of starting. And it may not even be necessary because, if they're just Joe Blow person who works a normal office job and commutes to work like everybody else, it's not something you really need to spend a lot of time dwelling on because we all know about those things, right? And so even if this is a story where, I don't know, let's say it's something like Arrival and aliens have landed, right? We don't need to have like a whole typical day as they go to work and they teach their class and then they go home. What you really need is I'll never forget the day that my class was interrupted by aliens arriving. Because we know what it's like to be a teacher, right? And you'll get the framework, you'll get your footing. It's not such immense world building that you need to establish all that. At least that's my thought. What do you think, Gareth?
Yeah, I think it's like a case of that when it comes to normality and normal life, we're more than capable of filling in the blanks. We don't need to follow along with that character as we see their entire day schedule. Wake up, get washed, have breakfast, commute, go through work, have lunch. We That's not establishing normal life. We assume that that's normal life. And if you're going to include any scenes, and it's always a good idea to include scenes of that, of course, you do have to show what normal life is like for the character a little, so we can get to know them, and it sets up the journey for the story. The whole story is about how the journey changes them and changes their life. So, of course, we need to kind of, set some groundwork there for the beginning. But if you're going to be having them go through these otherwise banal or what would normally be banal situations and spots of their day, then you want to make those situations interesting. Have something different about them. It's a normal situation, but it's different to what we normally get or normally expect. And that can be made different in a few different ways. The easiest is, of course, there's something different about the situation itself. Yes, it's lunch, but there's something crazy going on in the corner that the character has to react to. So it's not a normal lunch anymore. Or it's a normal lunch, but the character themselves is doing it differently, is doing weird things or thinking strange things throughout it. So you just make sure that there's differentiators in there. It is not interesting to watch a character brush their teeth.
Nope. Unless it's like the Flintstones and they're using a weird toothbrush, right? And that's a world building element.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah, a big chunk of meat.
All right. So that being said, let's move on to your next ingredient, which is introduction to the main character, and bonus points if you actually like them. It's very important.
Yeah. Very important in the early stages of your story. And again, this is one of these things that I don't want to be too hard line on in terms of first chapter only, because it's not necessarily the case. We'll mention a little bit about this in some of the avoids, because there are places where, your first chapter may not necessarily involve your main character at all. And that's fine. As long as it works for the story. But certainly within those first few chapters, and I think for sure the first character that we actually kind of settle in with should be the main character. We have to get an introduction to them, start to see who they are very quickly, and get a kind of handle on who they are very quickly. This is tough for a lot of people, and easily, it's easy for it to be tough, I guess, is the way to phrase that,
Yeah.
because It's you've got a whole novel, you have a whole story here to unpack a character. That's what it's about. We're going to start seeing different elements of them. You can't pack it all in the beginning.
Right.
So there's a few tips for that. Now, one of the things that you really need to understand, and I think everybody writing needs to understand, whether it's novels or screenplays, whatever you're writing, if you're telling stories about characters, you have to understand that the moment we come into a story with new characters, we do not care about them. They're a nobody. They're nothing to us. They have materialized into our lives on a page.
Mhm.
Lots and lots of people seem to think that if they just set up a story with a character, he is the kind of everyman archetype. And I go through this sequence of showing them get up in the morning and they're not too happy about going to work, but they're going to do it anyway. And it's all the same as everybody else on Earth, that a reader will identify with that and thus like the character. It couldn't be any more different in reality.
Mhm.
We just find nothing to hook onto there. Is I don't actually empathize because they're not standing out to me dramatically. It's just
Mhm.
anybody else. So keep that in mind. And it also translates to real life. I mean, perhaps other people aren't quite as callous as I am, but you tend to find that when you meet when you meet somebody, a group of people in real life, let's say you all get together and you're sitting down at a bar and you've never met half of these people before, you don't care about them. They're not really uh, interesting to you until
Right.
you start a conversation with them and they
Right.
reveal that they have a hobby that matches yours, that there's something
Right.
about them that's quirky and interesting and fun, and you're like, I like this guy. It
Yeah.
takes a little time to and it takes a specific element to arise from that person before you latch on in that way. And
Yeah.
it's exactly the same with characters in stories, so you have to do
And
that very, very quickly.
And to your point, usually in those situations, it's not like the person's like, you know what, I really like taking a warm shower in the morning, and you're like, what? Me too. That's not usually what tends to attract you to somebody. It's more if they can come up with a really interesting, quirky detail about themselves, even if it's something that you've never done in your life. It's like, you know what, I swam the English Channel, and they're like, well, that's kind of interesting. How did you do that? How did you train for it? And things like that. It just starts to make the person more interesting. It's like the old icebreaker is, the two truths and a lie, right? And you try to come up with more outrageous details about yourself because that tends to be more interesting. And to your point, you can think that, oh, well, everybody will relate to this person because they're just like everybody else. But it's like, but that's not very interesting because why do I want to spend time with somebody that's just like everybody else? Some of the most popular characters are extreme versions of a personality that that doesn't resemble the average person. And people love to dress up as like horrible villains and things like that. Like people can be attracted to all kinds of things, especially if they are a bold character. So yeah, don't hold back on that.
Yeah, there's always good ways to differentiate between characters as well. If you have multiple characters in your story, make sure that they are completely different kind of archetypes, because people getting involved in a story properly, they are generally happy as long as they can identify in some way with even just one character. And that doesn't have to be the main character either. It can be one of the side characters, one of their sidekicks, and they'll go along with it because they like one of the characters. They see some affinity in them. And I was going to say, a bit of an easy tip for this one. It's a little bit of a cheat code, and it's not the save the cat thing. Um, a lot of people tend to latch onto that, and it's like, well, if you
Yeah.
really want your character to quickly become uh, liked by your audiences, have them perform an act of kindness, especially to an animal, where Save the Cat comes from.
Yep.
That feels a little inorganic quite often
It
when
can
it
be
comes
very
up.
contrived. You see,
Yeah.
like, the person, like, helping the elderly person across the street, and you're like, "Oh, I know what you're doing, writer. I can see right through that," you
Yeah,
know?
and one of the easiest ways to avoid that, I find, and this regardless of genre, is making people laugh. Get a little bit of comedy, something to
Yes.
do with the character, and
Yes.
usually if it's self-deprecating as well, if it kind of puts them down
Mhm.
and makes you laugh, it ingratiates you very, very quickly with that
Yep.
person.
Yep.
Now that's tough because we don't. In the first chapter or the first three chapters or something with a character that we're dealing with, we don't really know them a lot so far, so it's hard to make you laugh. But just think of concepts of comedic setup and punchline. A
Yep.
lot of the same thing works, especially in horror. They're almost two sides of the same coin there, where you set expectations through repetition, and then on like the third repetition goes wrong. It's something different that you get. Usually responds with either, depending on the setup, abject horror, because what you set up as an expectation of normality has been twisted in a horrible way, or comedy because it's been twisted in a funny way. So you can start setting up and giving your reader an idea of who this person might be. For example, you are showing them being callous a couple of times, but then the next thing they do is not callous. They turn around and do something uh, really altruistic. At that moment is a little bit of difference. It's something that steps out of what we thought they were, and
Right.
that's very ingratiating. And also, if you put them in a funny moment, well, it's doubly ingratiating because there's really no better connection, quite frankly, with other people than making someone laugh. It's a joyful experience for a reason.
No, exactly. I often talk about the ways to make an unlikable character likable, if that makes sense, is often humor. You'll notice it. Like think of the television show Sherlock, and he's a rather unlikable person. He's really rough around the edges, but he's very dark in his humor, and it makes him likable. Or Marvel did it with Doctor Strange and Iron Man, both very narcissistic characters that you wouldn't necessarily like, but they're very funny, so you find you like them. The other thing too, I'll point to, besides the save the cat idea, which is that they do something noble, is make them very capable at something. We just naturally find people that are really good at something interesting. Like you can watch something like, America or Britain's Got Talent or something, and you have no idea about this person, but just the fact that they practice something really well, you're kind of engaged and you're interested in what they can do. And that's the same thing with any sort of talent or skill. And that just immediately starts to make you find them interesting, because it just shows it shows that they're driven towards something, right? They're not just this lump of something going through life, and that could be the trickiest. That can be the worst trap that writers can fall into, because I think to some degree that's where we're coming from as artists. We're like, oh, it's hard to get motivated in the morning and it's hard to do things, and so you write these apprehensive characters that are like, oh, life, it's kind of frustrating, and that's not really a great place to start. It's better to start with a driven character that's moving towards something, even if it's completely the wrong direction, just because it's easier to jump on that train. Catherine, do you have anything about main characters?
I think the only thing I can really add that hasn't been added by the wisdom of Gareth and Daniel here is to put yourself in the shoes of the reader. That sometimes you get so caught up in plot that you don't think about what it's like just experiencing the book from a reader's perspective. The reason we say introduce your first character in your first, like your main character in your first chapter, is because we subconsciously, when we read, latch on to the first POV character. And we look for things to relate to or have opposite reactions to with that character. And that's sort of what connects us to them and makes us care about this story. If it's a prologue, because I saw somebody mention a prologue, we know the prologue's probably not going to carry the main character, so we just don't even think about it. We disconnect. We're viewing
Right.
somebody's story. But once you're in chapter one, whoever's story is being followed is the person we are going to assume we're following through the whole book. So be careful not to bait and switch. For example, it's becoming really popular to put the villain.
Uh-oh, we
Oh,
lost her.
technological
Apparently,
issues.
the villain. Yes, I think she was getting at it can be popular to put the villain up front, and that can be very confusing,
Mhm.
because then you're like, oh, well, I'm following this person, and then, oh, she's back.
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay.
But yeah, just like you were saying, we're following the villain and we're looking for things to empathize with, even though they might not be the best people, which makes them even more intriguing. And then it's like, surprise! They're the villain, and you're not going to see them again except through the other person's POV. And you almost feel cheated because it's like,
Yep.
well, now I care about the villain more than I cared about the main character, and I really would rather follow the villain's story. And so you, like, cheat your readers of the satisfaction of growing with the main character in order to make them feel something for the villain. So there's a balance. There's a balance. Introduce the main character first is usually best, so that that's who the characters are like, or the readers are like, this is who I want to follow with. And then from there, if you have secondary or third POV characters, and you're going to alternate chapters, that's fine, but we still know this person was mentioned first. It's their growth that I'm supposed to be going alongside.
And I wanted
All right.
to just highlight this comment from Stephanie in case we missed it. But Stephanie, I think there's more gold buried in that than you perhaps recognize as well, in terms of the comedic aspect and idiosyncratic behavior from a character. That is incredibly, very, very interesting. If that followed a character's morning routine, they get up, walk into the shower, and they're showering with the pajamas still on, and then just arms straight by their side, walking out of the bathroom into the next room. There's so much raises out of that in terms of questions immediately. You're just like, what's going on? Why are they doing this? What's happening? Are they depressed? And they're just like, no, it saves money. That is funny. And things like that, keep that kind of stuff in mind. It might sound weird, crazy, but it works.
I actually see a comment on here that really caught my attention, which is the Star Wars reference, because I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I started writing because of Star Wars fan fiction. That's and that's about Darth Vader. George Lucas, who actually wrote the Star Wars book and then, of course, made the movies, he claimed that in his original plan, Darth Vader is actually the protagonist of his series in a way. He's like an anti hero. So the story is actually supposed to follow his growth, his redemption arc, basically. And the other characters, while also being main characters, are there to steer him in that direction for his redemption at the end.
All right. So moving on, we have conflict.
Does it
Yes,
need to be said?
doesn't need to be said. Always conflict. Always.
Yes, it's one of the ingredients, so we have to have it here.
Yeah.
Pretty much, almost every step of your story should have some kind of conflict going on to keep things interesting, and the same can be said entirely about your beginning. The main thing to understand about conflict as a writer doesn't mean your character woke up and got punched in the face immediately. Simply that there are problems, like I said
Right.
earlier. Make sure that there are problems being dealt with as soon as possible, because it's through problem solving that we see the character. And you'll start to, when you think about that, how all of these things that we mentioned so far and will mention after this kind of come together and combine to make a compelling opening. And conflict is a key part of it. Make sure there are problems that need to be solved.
Right. I mean, again, this is where you can end up with a first chapter where things are just kind of happening and the main character's kind of going through the daily grind or something. And it's like, well, like, why do I care? Like, what's going on? Like, you need to have, if if you don't have an inciting incident that early, which you probably don't have the major inciting incident in the first chapter, but you need to have a hint that something is wrong, right? Something about the main character's life needs to change, even if they don't know it. It's something we're aware of, or there's something kind of looming on the horizon that's going to affect the main character in some way, or just something. We need something to latch onto as a reason for us to be motivated to keep reading, at least at first. And it can be a small conflict that just leads you to a bigger conflict, like, the main character can't find their keys or something, but at least it's something to latch onto to get you through that opening scene, right? And sometimes you'll read opening scenes and it feels like there's no conflict at all. It's just, then they went to the store and they got groceries and you're like, I don't understand why this is even relevant. Catherine?
Yeah, I call that taking the life before too far. And a lot of times, though, honestly, it takes the form of info dumps and backstory. And as the author, you just think that the reader has to know this stuff. I'm getting a little ahead here, but just to say that can delay your conflict. Um, Interspersing that stuff with the conflict is key. Because ultimately, like we said earlier about why should I read, beyond the characters, it's why should I care? What am I going to be experiencing with these characters? And if I'm just experiencing normal life, in a lot of genres, that's not enough to make me want to read more. If I read, and sorry, backing up just a second because I got ahead of myself. The older, more classic fantasies are good examples, like The Hobbit and The Fellowship of the Ring. Really, really slow startup, and that worked back then, and that's fine. But modern novels being signed, readers are having shorter attention spans. They're wanting to get to the meat of the story faster. So they want to see the theme and they want to see the conflict that's going to come up while they're experiencing that, whether that's internal conflict, like here's what's going on and I'm battling. I want to be a good person because everybody else around me in this dystopian world is falling apart. But I still have to live too, so I'm going to have to steal and I'm going to have to do this. And then you get a sort of dual nature of that, even if it's internal and not external conflict.
Yep. Well, you'll notice the movies, the Lord of the Rings movies, they start with basically an info dump. But the reason why they do the info dump at first is to give you that conflict, because the actual book starts with a typical day, which is not typical to us. So it's pretty interesting. But, and I'm not going to obviously criticize Tolkien, but to your point, for a modern audience, probably wouldn't be done like that. You'd probably jump to the conflict of what the ring is about much earlier. Gareth?
No, I think that covers it.
All right, so moving on, we're now going to address things. Oh, actually, no, there's one more, and that's one more ingredient, and that is a clear goal. And what do you mean
Yes.
by that?
A clear goal for your characters in this early point of the story. Again, this is really just something that needs to be focused on as an ingredient to save you from meandering, which is, again, just telling the banal stuff. Now, the goal itself, whatever it is, has to be compelling in some way. Whenever I say a clear goal, that doesn't mean the goal of the story, because, again, our inciting incident hasn't shown up yet. We're not quite privy to what is actually going on in this plot, or where it may end up, or what the big battle is going to be. However, that doesn't mean that around that, everybody is just flopping around doing the usual stuff that they do. They should still have a clear, compelling goal in the beginning. Now, Daniel mentioned something earlier in terms of potential conflict if somebody can't find their keys. Now, again, that in itself could be a goal in an opening. They're stuck with a problem. What is the problem? They can't find their keys. The goal is to find the keys, and that is clear. Without finding those keys, they can't move on to the next part of the story. However, finding your keys that are between the cushions of the sofa isn't a particularly compelling problem to be dealing with. Again, it's very banal. Everybody's been there, so it's not an interesting opening. However, you could use that as the framework for something more interesting by putting
Right.
the reason the keys are missing and all sorts of crazy stuff around that changes it all up. And thus it is more actually interesting. But the clear goal, the point is, they complete the goal for that scene, perhaps. It may stretch on a little longer, but if they do complete the goal at that scene, what happens upon completion of that goal introduces another problem. It changes the goal. So as we move into the next scene or the next chapter, we're now going to have another goal. So it's always clear what they're actually trying to achieve. And if you keep that in mind, it's just being, I need a clear goal, something that the character is actually pushing for and trying to achieve that is compelling, that is different, then it stays interesting. It's not, again, watching the character brush their teeth in the bathroom mirror, which is not interesting in any way, shape, or form.
Yep, absolutely. And this is for all genres. I hear sometimes authors that are like, well, I'm writing a memoir, so I don't have to put their goal. But that's almost sort of the opposite. You should have even better idea of what their goal was, because you're hearing it from a real life person. What does this character want from the current place they are in their life? And then that can lead into your conflict when you have your inciting incident, whether that's internal again or external. But regardless of your genre, this is a person, and that person should want something in the current place of their life. Whether that's in, Hunger Games, Katniss Everdeen wants to protect and provide for her family, and then everything gets thrown helter skelter. Shutter Island, you got somebody coming to interview an inmate and figure out if that inmate is in a good frame of mind or not to move forward with the plan of action that they're wanting. And I don't want to leave spoilers there. So his goal is just, okay, let me interview this inmate and see if he's in a good frame of mind. Well, then everything gets thrown out the window. Jurassic Park, I want to see dinosaurs. So it's like, here's their goal. Here, we know what they want. Now, do they get it or not? And what happens because of it?
Exactly. Yep. But having something to latch onto is going to get you through the beginning and not make it seem, again, like you're not sure the what or the why. This is more of the what than the why. The why is more the theme. This is more of the what, but you need to know both. All right, so we're going to move on to things to avoid. such as a cliche opening, like, I don't know, waking up. How about that one?
Everybody loves cliches. I did want to point out just one comment I saw that made me chuckle with Jim fighting a 5-year-old to get them to brush their teeth. Now, there
Yes,
is conflict. You see, yes,
I
these
do have a
boring things
5-year-old.
can be made more interesting. You have a character starting their day with a thrashing 5-year-old who covers their pristine work suit that they're already running late in toothpaste, and again, wrap more interesting elements around that in terms of the chaos that's going on in that house and what that can tell us about the character and how they need to get to work because of reasons, and suddenly things become more interesting. It's much more active. So yeah, that's a pretty good starting point for a much better way to approach something that could otherwise be banal. But cliche openings, yes, waking up is a common one. It's one of these things that would probably, in just about any kind of MFA class, your tutor would probably say the one thing you never do is have a character waking up in the beginning to the sound of an alarm clock. Now, I don't believe that. As much as everybody shakes their heads there, I say if it works for the story and you're making it interesting,
No, it never
well,
worked.
then it can work. There's nothing wrong with that. Was Back to the Future not one with Marty McFly waking up in the morning? Um, I may be
Mm-mm.
wrong, but there
No,
there
it
are there
doesn't.
are various stories.
It does have clocks, but he's not waking up. He's playing the
Ah,
guitar.
what's one where it works right in the morning, waking up? 40-year-old virgin. There you go. Really great comedy, and that uses that kind of tropey stack of situations of waking up and going to the toilet, especially, and various things that make a really great opening. And again, is comedy and makes us love that character very quickly.
Mhm.
It can work. Sometimes it's the only place where you should, when you're again striving to start in medias res, um, that it's the right place to do it because everything else that happened before that is bland, but things actually kick off at the sound of the alarm clock. There's no need to think too harshly about these things, but do avoid cliche openings as much as you can, which would be things like the alarm clock opening. If you can shift it forward by all means, please do. Descriptions of weather, it was a dark and stormy night, is now super cliche, that kind of thing. The whole what we've talked about 50 times so far today, characters looking at themselves in the mirror and inspecting or brushing their teeth or whatever they're doing. um, Jumping straight in the beginning, like your first paragraph is just character description, is not good either. It just slows things down from the off.
I love
Yeah,
this. What if it
opening in
really
a
is a
bar.
dark and stormy night? The point is not that you can't have a dark and stormy night. It's just beginning with that specific phrase. It was a dark and stormy night is a cliche, and starting with a mood setting of weather is tricky, just because, I mean, to be honest, it's not normally the best place to start anyway, because what you really want to be focusing on is what somebody is doing, not the environment around them per se. But I will say, again, this is always Garrett's point, if it works, it works. I just would not use specifically, it was a dark and stormy night, that phrase. Any other cliches that you can think of?
Opening in a bar just to give us an info dump.
Mm.
Like opening in a bar to then have a scene where a bunch of vampires are the barkeepers and the main character wasn't expecting it, that's great. Opening in a bar so that he can talk for 6 pages to the person next to him about the woes of his life is old.
Yeah. It's common in general to do that kind of info dumpy beginning. It's like, oh, they get into a taxi and they talk to the person, or they've started a new job and they talk to a person, and that is a way to get information out there. And I can't say it never works, but it's a
Right.
risky strategy.
Well, for the opening especially, because with the opening you have the opportunity to show us living through those events instead of him telling somebody else about those events or her telling somebody else about those events.
Yes. That gets to our next point, which is to avoid info dumping and backstory overload. And Catherine, you can tell me all about that, because that
Yeah.
never happened, right?
Never, never. I didn't just say that out loud. This is being recorded for posterity. Yeah, you have an entire book to share your character's backstory, and if you're one of the genre writers that writes an entire universe, like sci-fi or fantasy or middle grade fiction sometimes, you always need to know more about your book than the reader will ever need to know. because you have to be able to think in your head, how are people going to talk to each other, what's the hierarchy like, but that doesn't mean the characters need that information in that specific scene. So reeling in those darlings a little bit, those well thought out, well researched bits of information, and cutting it down to what does the reader need to know for this specific plot point and this specific thing the character is experiencing to make sense. So if they
Right
are
now.
going into a bar and it's a or a space opera, ghost opera, totally different thing. Space opera, then you need to say he sat down next to a six-legged man and he was drinking a blue drink with fish floating in it or something, and then that gives us the idea, all right, these aren't humans and here's the setting, but you don't need to tell us the six-legged man was called a whatever name and the drink he was drinking was called this and it was toxic to humans and all this other side stuff. You can sort of reel in that world building just a little bit and help us stick to the meat of the story in the first chapter so you don't lose your readers.
Yeah. And the issue with that too is that it's like the old Chekhov's gun concept from playwriting, right? If you put a gun on the mantelpiece, you have to shoot it off. As soon as you start introducing details, especially early on, in a first chapter, you get the idea that these details are going to matter. Because why in the world are you telling me otherwise? So imagine he does go into the bar, right? And he's having a drink, and they're like, well, this drink is toxic to this group or whatever. My assumption is, well, he's going to splash it on somebody, or there's going to be some sort of reason why they're bringing this up. Otherwise, it's like it just kind of hangs there. And then you're like, well, I don't know what this author is doing because they're just introducing random details that are not particularly relevant to the actual action that's going on right now, and it can make it hard to find my footing.
I love
Gareth?
that somebody brought up Hitchhikers too, because that was the first sci-fi book that I ever read that was an adult sci-fi. But even then, there's a tension in that scene, and it's like foreboding, oncoming doom that while this is the normal, something is quickly approaching.
Yeah, in the opening scene, you have the Earth is going to get destroyed. Like it jumps into it pretty fast. It dials up to an 11, and then it's kind of a crazy ride after that. It's very Alice in Wonderland. Immediately you're in the other world. Gareth?
No, I am perfectly happy with everything Catherine said. It's mainly when it comes to me, it's spread it as much as possible throughout the book. Bring up information at the time it's pertinent and necessary. Otherwise, just let us inhabit the world and go with it.
Yeah.
Personally, I don't have to deal with much of that problem because I don't write fantasy or sci-fi, so I'm not dealing with so many issues. But a lot of it is, I guess, we love the phrase "show don't tell." There's also "no, don't show." You as the author know all this stuff and you're wrapping it up and melding it into a living breathing world that's in action, and we're just watching that world in action. You don't necessarily have to tell us everything.
All right. Another thing to avoid. Be careful with too much focus on side characters that are not the main character, the protagonist. I think sometimes people get confused about this because they'll be like, well, main characters, I have a lot of main characters. When we're talking about main character most of the time on this show or protagonist, we're talking about who's driving the story forward, right? Who is that driving force that is pushing the action? And, sometimes they start out where maybe more things are kind of happening to them and then they'll take a more proactive approach later on, but they're going to be at the heart of the story, the person that is involved in pushing the story forward. Side characters are kind of more along for the ride, even if they can have influence. And what you don't want is for the audience to be confused as to who they're supposed to be focused on, like who matters. And this can be particularly challenging in ensemble sort of pieces. What do you think about this, Gareth? What's a good way of balancing this?
Yeah, it's a lot of you'll find this a lot happening in because this is why these things are never 100%, and entirely uh, applicable to everything and anything. Is that lots of thriller and horror novels, especially, will actually open with a set piece involving either the murder or death or something of someone who is disconnected from the main story, and that's fine. In fact, one of my favorite openings in the horror genre is Jack Kilborn's Afraid, which is basically involves the home invasion and murder of two characters who just kind of live in the area, where all the action takes place afterwards. And that's a superb opening because it sets the scene. Most recently, I read Adam Neville's Cunning Folk, which opens in much a similar way, which is a character who currently lives in this house, killing himself, but it's setting the scene for the family who's going to move into that house. It's all related, it's all in there. But the crucial thing is that you don't spend too much time and really kind of spending too long trying to make us care about these characters and really get into who they are and spend multiple chapters trying to make us truly care about them. Because the longer you spend there, the more we start to assume these are actually our main characters. And like Catherine said earlier, whenever they summarily just disappear from the story, it feels like you've been cheated. It just sours the broth more or less. So don't spend too long. You can certainly have an opening like that. As I said, a lot of thrillers do. I'm trying to remember the name, but I always get tongue tied live. A lot of serial killer thrillers will do that with opening with commercial thrillers, very very big
Right.
names, such as Karen Slaughter. I think was the name on my lips there. Will open with the killer killing somebody, and that's almost an inciting incident because the next chapter, what's going on? Our detective is arriving on the scene to find out and kick off the story proper. So there's nothing wrong with actually starting with side characters, but don't dwell on it.
Yep. So somebody was asking, can they have two important characters? Of course you can. Yeah, that's not the issue. That's not what we're getting at. So since we're not saying you can't have multiple important characters, what's kind of the difference you think, Gareth, to have a prominent character or something like that? Because
What's that? Explain that. Sorry.
oh no, it's okay. Because they said, can you have two important characters? Of course, you can have multiple characters that are important, that matter, right? But to have a primary driving force is just helpful for the audience to track for various reasons, I think is what we're getting at.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with a couple of important characters showing up there. But the point is, in the early stages of the story, we need to get to the main character quickly, too. So, again, don't paint this kind of image too early on that these characters you're focusing on in the beginning are actually the main protagonists if they're not. And the longer you spend on that, the more you're actually telling people that they are.
Yep.
Yeah.
Then we have focus on side characters creating too many B stories. Well, certainly this is early on, right? B stories usually do not come up in a first chapter. Probably not the best idea. You want to stick to that A story. You want to really hammer it home to get that audience hooked in, interested before you start introducing B stories, because otherwise you're just starting in too many places. It's too complicated, and you're not getting enough mileage out of your A story. That's what I would think anyway. All right. Starting too slow. This is an issue, right?
Yeah, we kind of mentioned this, but it's worth kind of hitting again as a little point. Is
Well,
don't be too slow. Reader patience is thin, especially these days. People need to feel hooked as quickly as possible, and sometimes the key to that is actually hitting what we mentioned just previously with a lot of those thriller and horror openings where a big event, somebody killed off immediately. That may not be a main character, but somebody got killed off in the first chapter. Say, whoa, now I'm invested. I'm in this. There's a mystery. I want to find out what's going on. You want to hook people as quickly as possible. And this kind of slow, banal openings that we mentioned previously with the character waking up and brushing their teeth and getting ready and going out, it just slows things down. And very, very quickly, 3-4 chapters in, if I'm not seeing any direction or I'm not feeling a hook here that there really is any story happening, I'm gone.
One sentence.
yeah, here's a question. Should the first chapter be shorter than a typical book chapter? I don't think necessarily. It really depends on what's going on in that first scene, right? If you have a really interesting, power packed first scene and you don't want to chop it up into different chapters because you want the flow to be a certain way, I don't think that's a problem at all. I don't think there's any need to think that it needs to be shorter. I could see why you might like that, to have a hook early on and then some sort of cliffhanger and you keep going. It just depends on the genre. So any thoughts on that, Gareth?
No, 100% the same. It depends. Yeah, a lot of this, again, these are ingredients to throw in a big pot and stick in the oven, but what comes out the end depends on your personal spices and all of the things that you've done yourself there. So there's lots of flexibility. It's a creative field at the end of the day. So I couldn't tell anybody that a chapter must be 3,000 words or something that's silly. Some chapters with some authors, some first chapters may be a single sentence, just something that really sets the mood. And you're like, ooh, okay. And then
Wait,
you move into the story in chapter 2. That can be done.
All right. Well, we've had a great discussion here about first chapters. I've enjoyed all of your comments and your questions. We certainly could do more about this, and we will. So if you enjoyed the discussion and you want to see more discussions, please like, subscribe, hit the bell, and feel free to comment below too on subjects that you'd like to hear us talk about, or even if it's specific about first chapters or whatever it is, let us know. But I actually am going to have to head out here, but I'm going to pass the baton over to Gareth to tell you about what's going on in the world of AutoCrit, which deals with first chapters. So, Gareth, take it away.
Indeed. Top of the hour, so we'll have to jump. But I will have to say, anybody here, if you have any additional questions, kind of off the back of this, feel free to reach out to us. If you're an AutoCrit member, you can pop into the community over at Mighty Networks, make a post, send a message, whatever you like to do. Happy to help. But we do have, and I got a reveal today before we jump off, a special offer discount happening for the rest of this week with the wonderful Katherine on first chapter critiques. So we hope that a lot of the tips and things we've talked about today help you with your first chapters. If you're like, oh, my opening definitely needs a bit of massaging here. Beyond that, if you would like a professional reader set of eyes on it to give you professional feedback, the price is dropped to half price and with an additional personal call. So Katherine will actually jump on a call with you and talk through all of the feedback that she's given you. I will pop a link to that in the chat here while everybody's actually live. That'll be the rest of this week, and we'll pop an email out about it as well. So if you have a first chapter or a few to get looked at, please do take advantage. Good thing about that is if you have looked today and thought, oh, no, I really need to make some changes here, is you can purchase your critique today and don't worry about banking it throughout the rest of the year. So you can actually purchase a few critiques, keep them in your belt, and just come around when you've actually got stuff that needs looked at. And we'll give you that feedback. Do you want to say anything about that, Katherine?
Yeah, I love reading your first chapters, and yeah, I'm sitting here ready to read your first chapters. Nothing makes me happier than these promos because I love getting to talk to you guys, which is something that you normally have to buy like a story doctor session for or catch me in the community for. In this case, it's like you are dedicated 30 minutes of my time to talk through pain points in your story or goals for your story. So, yeah, I'm excited.
Alrighty. Fantastic. It's Tammy, it's word count up to 3,000 words. So, like people have mentioned there, your first chapter might only be a sentence. we wouldn't be so callous as to say that's all that's going to get looked at. It's up to the first 3,000 words. So that could include two, three chapters. And that's that. I think Daniel jumped because of the time. So we will leave everybody. If you do have any questions, like I said, please reach out. I'm always happy to help. And we will see you back live next week. Thank you very much.
Bye.